You have the same debate, by and large, in America and Europe. It's about jobs and growth. Very simply put, for the first time in many years, we don't have this kind of thing where the Americans will be talking about security in Afghanistan and we're talking about something different. We're talking about absolutely the same thing. Secondly, on trade matters, where many people, including Peter Sutherland, a great multilateralist, often were somewhat skeptical about a transatlantic market because they saw this could lead to the fragmentation of a global WTO multilateral system, whereas actually it deals with issues which are non-tariff barriers, much so, which aren't actually in conflict with the WTO principles. But now the Doha round has basically been put very much to one side. There's a need for something really substantial. And lastly is that it's actually what's motivating the Americas on this trade agenda are the Chinese. It is very much driven by the fact that if Europeans and Americans can find common ground of getting rid of the barriers which remain to trade and investment, not only is that a good idea when we're living in an environment which is rather similar to the 1930s, where protectionism is around, but at the moment people have been strong enough to contain. But if we're capable of shaping a common agenda which is actually increasing growth, driving things together with transatlantic leadership in the global system, that is something which I think the Americans would welcome so long as we, in the European side, can meet our part of the bargain. So in conclusion, this to me is a rather different type of situation that we've had if we get this right. And we don't just keep it to the nuts and bolts on trade, but we actually think of things like the digital aspects, the financial services, research and innovation, and things which can actually see where we can have real EU-US cooperation. In my view, we'll then have shapings of a rather different type of 21st century than the one we've thought of for the moment. There's just a proliferation over the last 5 to 10 years in particular of American foundations coming to Brussels to influence us on American thinking. There's almost been no movement other than for the Bertelsmann Foundation moving into Washington of making sure European voices are heard there. So my advice there would be to European leaders, focus on in Washington, because I think that's where we need a greater European presence, either in the nation states or working together, putting some funding in to be able to make sure European views are properly clearly heard, picking up the point that Sean was just mentioning. What we're finding is looking at the long-term trends from a European perspective, looking at the long-term trends from an American perspective, it's the same kind of things. It's about the empowerment of the individual. It's about the rise of the shift of economic power to Asia. It's about shortages of energy, food, raw materials, you name it. Once we have a common analysis, then you can begin to have joint action and make sure you have transatlantic leadership in the global system. That is where we're headed. It's not about nuts and bolts, about one particular regulation or another. It's about the survival and promotion of our values and our type of society in a very rapidly changing world. In the context of this EU-US relationship, we need to have a strategic partnership. We have 10 or 11 of them across the globe, but the EU-US is not classified as one of them. And if you look at the US-China dialogue, it's a strategic economic dialogue. When I asked a leading American, why is this strategic and we just have a transatlantic economic dialogue, he said, oh, we have many more problems with the Chinese than with the Europeans. We call that strategic. But my thinking is that if we really wish to have a really thinking of transatlantic leadership, we need to have a strategic economic dialogue.